Are you writing a letter, young fella? Yes, sir, to my parents back in Scotland. I'm letting them know I'm heading west to seek my fortune. Fortune? Sonny, I'm sitting on $1 million idea, just waiting for investors. 20 years ago, an unknown explorer discovered the world's most simple-to-store food source. It's nutritious and easy to raise, too. Yes? What is it? Square eggs, son. Square! Did you say square eggs? Yes, a padre in Cuzco told me he came from a lost valley in the Andes where square poultry is raised by little square people. Little square people too, eh? For years I've sought a museum to sponsor my search for that hidden valley. You old con man, if this is a square egg, then I'm the chicken that laid it. One of comics' best kept secret is duck comics. Yes, you heard me right. Comics featuring ducks. And I'm not just talking any ducks here. Obviously, in Marvel, you have Howard the Duck. He's pretty well known. But no, I'm talking about the classic Disney ducks. Donald Duck, his nephews Huey, Dewey, and Louie, and his uncle Scrooge McDuck. These are secretly some of the best comics that have ever been put to paper, at least according to some. When you look at the works of legendary creator Carl Barks from back in the day and his more recent still living heir and inheritor, Don Rosa. These comics have been secretly incredibly influential, secretly very popular, and some of just the best comics that you'll read. Chief among these in many people's hearts is The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck by Don Rosa, a 12 or so issue story detailing the life of Scrooge McDuck from his childhood all the way up until right before his adventures with Donald, Huey, Dewey, and Louie. You find out how exactly he became the Scrooge that we all know him to be. If this is your first time here, allow me to introduce myself. My name is Steven, but you might better know me by my superhero alter ego, Spike Stonehand. Here, I look at comics from across the globe and across the history of the medium to expand my knowledge of its breadth and depth as an art form. In fact, I'm reading 52 comics over 52 weeks to do just that. And you can join me along in the journey. We have the categories for all 52 comics in the description of this video below. You can give this video a like, share it with a friend who likes comics, subscribe to my channel so that you can never miss an update, and comment below with some of your favorite duck comics. You can also read my writing over at spikestonehand.com. There I have new comics buyer's guides and weekly or bi-weekly roundups to all of the comics industry news, reviews, interviews. You can also support me over on Patreon for $5 a month. You get your name thrown in at the end of this video. But without further ado, I would like to extend to you a welcome to my channel, Divining Comics, where I explore the magic hidden between the panels of your favorite comics.
Boys and girls, your attention, please. Presenting a new exciting radio program featuring the thrilling adventures of an amazing and incredible personality.
So this video is supported by two pieces of media that I think you should listen to. First, if you want a little bit more knowledge about these duck comics. First, there's the Extra Issues podcast. Good friends of mine. You can oversupport them at the My Marvelous Year Patreon, patreon.com/MyMarvelousYear. There they have gone over in the Extra Issues podcast a bunch of different comics that whatever they want to read, and they recently wanted to read The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck, so they talked a little bit about some of the history there, the story of these comics. One of the hosts, Charlotte, I think this was one of her favorite comics growing up, so definitely check that out. And second, Matt, that's M-A-T-T-T-T with 4 T's there, has a couple of videos, one on Carl Barks and one on Don Rosa, talking about different ways that Disney has not treated them fairly, potentially. I believe so, and he argues so for sure. So check this out if you want a little bit more background on the subject. But here we're going to just talk about more about my thoughts on the series and what I liked, what I didn't like, all of that. So, like I said, this series, The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck, begins with a young Scrooge in Scotland. You know, he looks more like your classic Donald at this point. He is just a young lad. He's already very penny pinching, but there is a subtle character difference at the beginning of the story too, where he ends up at the story, right? The Scrooge that you know and love if you've maybe watched DuckTales or read any other Duck comics. He is greedy, but he is not yet mean. He's not yet selfish. He's a very honest man, if that makes sense, that even though he is very penny pinching and wants as much money as possible, he wants to earn his money, and they make a real big point of emphasizing that, especially early on, that he believes in the value of hard work, the value of a dollar, that kind of thing. He doesn't cheat people out of money, but he does really love it. And he ends up going to America at first, and then back and forth to Scotland, and then Australia, Canada, the Outback, all over the world. He travels a whole bunch in this series. It's why it's part of the globe-trotting comics that I'm covering in this month of June, alongside Tintin and Corto Maltese. So I read this comic digitally on my iPad, as you can see, using the Comics Plus app that my library has a subscription to, so you can get it for free that way, potentially. One of the reasons that I was glad to find this edition is that the 11th chapter of this series has been pulled from future reprintings because of racist depictions of Africans in that comic, and so it is no longer in print and potentially hard to find in a physical edition, but I was able to read that chapter here and can confirm, yes, it is kind of a racist depiction of an African. That's unfortunate, but that's just the way things go sometimes. But I will say one of the interesting things about this is how episodic it is. You could definitely read individual chapters if you wanted, if you could only find individual chapters for some reason. Each one is relatively self-contained, even though it does play a huge part in the story. And I think one of the things that Don Rosa does really well is that slow character development of Scrooge. Each chapter does become a little bit more isolated, a little bit more misanthropic, hating of his fellow, not human beings, his fellow animals, I guess, and a little bit more willing to cheat others because he feels like he has been himself dealt a raw deal in life. And I thought that was a really nice character touch, and I really like the way that this story develops incrementally each chapter, right? He will start off in an early issue being very open, very willing to meet people where they're at, and he gets swindled, he gets conned, he gets hurt, and each chapter he becomes a little bit more closed off. And like I said, that 11th chapter that does have the unfortunate depiction of an African character, I think it does still have certain artistic merits if you can, get past that. I don't know if that's something that you think you should get past, but the African tribal chief that he cons ends up haunting him with a literal zombie, right, in the old-fashioned original sense of the term, right? This kind of an undead being that is there to curse and haunt him. And I think that it does a really nice job of kind of showing his depravity in that penultimate point, that 11th chapter of the story, that he is kind of has a now physical manifestation of the evils that he's been engaging in and sunk to that low level. Now there's a physical reminder of that haunting him. I think it's a really powerful metaphor, and I just wish that it had been able to have been done with a little bit more tact, a little bit more taste, because I think it is a really interesting choice there to have that kind of, like I said, manifestation of all of his regrets and the evils that he did and the people that he's hurt. But don't get me wrong, this is in fact quite silly at times, like the intro sequence that I read to you where he is talking to a man about some square eggs that he thinks are fake, only to find out that the egg is real after it gets shot by a highway robbery stagecoach villain, right? There's lots of fun moments like that really, let you remember that this is, at the end of the day, kids' comics based off of a Disney cartoon. It's silly, it's fun, it's got a lot of fun gags. And another thing that I thought was really well written about this story is, surprisingly enough, a lot of the accent work and the dialogues that can get very tedious very quickly, right? Think of any of the Scottish characters in the Chris Claremont written X-Men era, or Irish characters, or really getting, Gambit, any character with an accent in Chris Claremont, it gets tedious to read their dialogue pretty quickly, but I find that it is done sparingly here, and usually for a really good point. There's a bit where he's in South Africa, and you eat the Boers, the Afrikaners there, and you get just a little hint of, teasing somebody based off of their accent there in a friendly way. I don't think in a hateful way. And that little hint here and there is really well done for something that could have become annoying very fast. One thing that, it's interesting, it's not necessarily a critique, but a thing that I noticed is because of the episodic nature of these chapters, it feels like there is a lot that is missing, right? He jumps through vast swaths of his life. There are characters that seemingly meant a lot more to him than we actually ever get on the page. I'm thinking particularly of Goldie, who is an implied love interest. She represents kind of the path not traveled, where he could have settled down and had a wife and kids and maybe not been the last of the McDuck name. He could have passed that on to a son of his own instead of through his nephew Donald and his great nephews Huey, Dewey, and Louie. Which, side note, I think I've always thought it was fascinating the way that the kind of relationship in all these Duck comics is uncle to nephew. I just thought that was a kind of silly relationship quirk there. I never really thought that there is that kind of sadder, tragic element to it, right? That, Scrooge McDuck is the last of his name, and he is no longer passing on his familia name to any of his descendants. There is something kind of sad about that. But it turns out a lot of these stories, I think, were collected in a later edition of Volume 2 of The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck, which has the kind of in-between, less plot-essential, but more character-driven stories. And I think that maybe it would have become tedious and unwieldy to include a lot of those elements here in this story, but I do think that it needed a little bit more of that at times. It needed a little bit more of letting us know who Scrooge's relationships are, how he feels about all these supporting characters. The Beagle Boys clearly become kind of a big, impactful thing, and I've never watched DuckTales, so I don't know if that's a recurring thing. It felt like that was kind of maybe the recurring villain in Duckburg. I'm not sure. But a lot of these characters, it feels like they get a lot of development off screen that if you're a smart reader, if you're an adult, you can figure out what's going on. But I wanted a little bit more. I wanted to know how these characters and their relationships were developing in a way that this volume is maybe a little bit more focused on the strict plot development and focused solely on Scrooge's character, not necessarily the supporting cast as much. And if you've never read this comic before, one thing that may strike you as surprising, it definitely struck me as surprising, is just how good the art is. You think the ducks are a relatively simple drawing, right, in this Disney style. You can't have too much detail, right? But Don Rosa finds a way to put in as much detail as he can, whether it's in the hatchwork for shading. It is incredible how detailed these could be. The most beautiful underground indie art comic you've ever read, based off of the black and white hatching of these characters, and it's the ducks that are from Disney cartoons. It's absolutely incredible how good a lot of these panels look. I'm going to try and probably show some of them at this part of the video, because I was just regularly in awe of how good this looked. And not only were the individual panels of the characters really detailed and drawn, the wide shots that he does are really great too. He never seems to shy away from having large crowd scenes, having fully rendered cityscapes and castles and buildings, and I was absolutely stunned regularly reading this comic how good looking it is. I can't imagine a tie-in comic today looking this good, right? If Dynamite is always putting out these Disney, cartoon comics, right? I think, Aladdin, Lion King, Stitch, Lilo and Stitch, right? And I don't think, no offense to any of the artists that are working on those, they're on tight monthly deadlines and they can't turn around stuff, but Don Rosa somehow is able to put more thought and line work and beauty and artistic skill and rendering into these ducks than maybe have ever been drawn before, and I was absolutely blown away. There's a number of panels that I am surprised are not regular memes out of context shared online, because they just look so good. It's like, instead of a reaction GIF, you have your reaction Scrooge. I think that could happen, because there are enough panels that look good enough and are funny enough out of context that they could make that work. While I'm not here to tell you that The Life and Times of Scrooge McDuck is secretly a leftist masterpiece that you've never considered before, I do think it does a good job for a piece of kids media at conveying that character arc for Scrooge of, like I mentioned, showing how somebody so concerned with money as an end into itself and not as, a means to living a good life, how that kind of corrupts your soul, how that makes you sad and lonely. It takes away all the relationships you have. It makes you kind of a hateful and grumpy person. And it's interesting kind of reading this volume that's how it ends. It does end with a bit of a hopeful note. The 12th chapter has, Donald and Huey, Dewey, and Louie meeting Scrooge and kind of inspiring him to like, oh, you know what, I still have some adventure left in me. And then presumably, as the story goes on and he spends time with his nephew and grandnephews, he becomes a little bit less hateful, a little bit less misanthropic. He redeems himself a little bit, maybe. I've never watched any DuckTales, I couldn't tell you. That's what I would assume happens here. So you do kind of have to end this prequel story at a low point, but it does kind of have a very interesting structure in that sense, right? It is a negative arc. You see Scrooge go from being a bright-eyed young person who sends money to his family to somebody who is so concerned with being not just the 18th richest person in the world, not having, so much money that he can, swim in 10 feet of it. No, he wants to swim in 100 feet of his coins. He wants to be the richest person in the world. And you can see how that drives away everyone that he used to care and love about and used to loving her about him. The final issue here ends with a repeated reference to the movie Citizen Kane, the Orson Welles movie, and he is kind of an Kane-like figure in that sense, right? He is somebody who got everything he wanted and realized that he lost the very things that mattered most to him in the end of the day. So I think that, it is kind of a bummer ending in an interesting way, especially for a piece of kids media, and I really like that and respect that. So your mileage may vary. Maybe you want your kids' comics a little bit happier of an ending. Then go read the rest of the Don Rosa collection, or, the Carl Barks library, where you see the adventures of Scrooge with, his family, and maybe a little bit more happy and upbeat of an ending there for his character. Wrapping things up, who would I recommend this for? Anybody. This is a great kids comic, even though it is pretty wordy for something that is ostensibly aimed at young people or people with more modern sensibilities. It is very readable. I think that you could hand this to any elementary school age kid or above. You could hand it to an adult like me, and they would find a lot of value here. This is just really good comics. So I'd recommend it to people who like adventure comics, people who like kind of globe-trotting characters and adventures and stories, and people who like looking at good art. If your kid has ever expressed interest in watching the old Disney cartoons, give them this and see what happens. Would I continue reading this? I definitely would continue reading Don Rosa Duck comics. Obviously, I'm not sure if I want to read right now the continued in-between stories like I mentioned, where you kind of get some more of the character moments. Maybe a selection of those where you get kind of the best of I'd consider reading. And I think Charlotte, that like I mentioned on the Extra Issues podcast from the My Marvelous Year Patreon, did do just that. I think she made a collection of the best issues there that you can check out. But if you hand me a graphic novel of some later Don Rosa stories, I would definitely check that out. I'd spend an afternoon reading that. And I think it's, you can read them all kind of as you go. You don't have to read them. They're not plot dense or lore dense. You don't have to know the chronology here. I think you can just jump into most of these stories and read them. So, if I find myself in a situation where I'm reading that, I definitely would. I wouldn't turn my nose up at it, but I'm not, dying to know what happens next, because this is a pretty complete story in and of itself. Thank you again for watching this video. If you would, like I mentioned, like this video, subscribe to the channel. I recently hit 50 subscribers, not to date this video and make it impermanent, but this Sunday, July 12th at 2 p.m. Central Standard Time, I think I'm going to have a little live stream to celebrate. So please tune in for that. Wait, and I'll see you then. And until next time, never let the magic of comics die.
Old Enoch, he lived to be 365 when the Lord came and took him back to heaven alive. I saw the light from heaven shining all around. I saw the light come shining. I saw that light come down.